What is one of history's strangest engines also became one of the most legendary. The Ford Flathead V-8 was the first mass-produced V-8 that changed the auto world upside down in 1932. It wasn't perfect. In fact, it was full of odd quirks, but those same quirks helped shape hot rodding, racing, and car culture itself. This engine wasn't just about power, it was about personality. By 1934, more than 2 million Flatheads were already on the road, shaping how Americans thought about V8s forever. So get ready, because today we are breaking down 20 of the weirdest facts about the Flathead V8. And don't forget to subscribe for more wild car stories. 1. Affordable V8s. When Ford dropped the Flathead V8 in 1932, it completely shook the car world. Before this, V8s were pricey luxuries tucked into big dollar machines. Henry Ford wanted none of that. He pushed his engineers to create a block that could be cast in one solid chunk of iron. The result? Costs plummeted, and suddenly everyday drivers could buy a car with 8 cylinders. By 1935, the little 4-cylinder option was gone because the V8 had stolen the attention. According to the Henry Ford, the Flathead became the go-to heart of Fords for over 2 decades. By the time production wrapped in 1953, Ford had cranked out more than 15 million Flatheads. Affordable speed, simple design, and massive sales. This engine wasn't just popular, it changed what power for the people looked like. 2 water pumps on one engine. Most engines get by with a single water pump. The Ford Flathead V8? It demanded 2. Each cylinder bank had its own pump, a design quirk that came from Henry Ford's early idea of using a thermosiphon system with no pumps at all. When that failed, engineers scrambled to fit a pair of pumps before the 1932 launch. But the pumps didn't even move the coolant the usual way. Instead of pulling cold water into the block, they sucked hot coolant out of the top. A backward system that made overheating a common gripe. And if that wasn't odd enough, the early Flathead also carried the helmet distributor, dual breaker points and a built-in coil crammed into one aluminum housing. Clever? Maybe? Weird? Absolutely. 3. Siamese exhaust ports. The Ford Flathead V8 didn't give every cylinder its own exhaust port. Instead, the 2 middle cylinders on each bank had to share one. That means instead of 8 distinct ports, the manifold acted more like a V6 setup, with those cylinders crammed together to breathe through the same passage. Ford engineers kept it this way to simplify casting and keep production costs low, but the trade-off was big. By routing exhaust gases through the block's water jackets, the setup piled on extra heat, fueling the Flathead's reputation for running hot. Performance tuners learned quickly that these Siamese ports were a major bottleneck for airflow. Odd, yes, but also uniquely Ford. An engineering shortcut that helped millions get V8 power, even if it meant the center cylinders were always whispering to each other. 4. 3 main bearing V8. Most V8s rely on 5 main bearings to keep the crankshaft steady. Ford's Flathead? It made do with only 3. That was not a rumor. Just 3 big bearings held the entire crank in place. Why? Cost and simplicity. Casting fewer supports meant less machining, faster production, and a cheaper engine overall. But here's where it gets strange. With fewer bearings, the crankshaft flexed more than usual, earning the Flathead a reputation for needing careful balance and steady oil pressure to survive. Push it too hard, and those journals could take a beating. Yet, despite this unusual setup, the Flathead became legendary for reliability and toughness. Weirdly enough, the very shortcut that seemed like a weakness helped make the engine affordable for millions, proving that sometimes less really is more. 5. Twin spark. Now here's a sight that would make any gearhead pause. A Flathead V8 running 2 spark plugs per cylinder. Instead of the usual 8, this beast carried 16 or even 24 plugs, depending on the setup. To handle all that spark, some engines used 2 distributors, 4 coils, and dual breaker points, crammed into one wild housing. It sounds like something out of a hot rodder's fever dream, but it was real. And enthusiasts have dug up examples proving just how far the Flathead could be pushed. Why go double? More consistent combustion, extra reliability, and in some cases, raw performance gains. Sure, it was complicated, but it showed how adaptable this simple V8 really was. 6. Over 50 different intakes. Let's take a look at a stat that proves just how wild the Flathead scene got. This engine had over 50 different intake manifold designs. We're talking everything from plain single-carb setups for everyday driving to radical multi-carb aluminum manifolds that racers swore by. Builders experimented with tall high-rise styles, side-by-side cars, long runners, and even bizarre homemade creations welded together in backyard garages. The variety was so crazy that the Smith Collection Museum of American Speed now displays more than 170 flathead intakes, ranging from crude hand-built pieces to polished cast aluminum beauties sporting 3 or 4 carb slots. For gearheads of the 40s and 50s, this buffet of choices was paradise. No two flatheads had to sound or perform the same. That endless mix-and-match freedom helped turn the engine into a true hot rod icon, fueled by creativity as much as horsepower. 7. Oversized pistons. One of the strangest quirks of the Ford Flathead V-8 was just how far you could push its cylinders. Hot rodders quickly discovered the blocks had enough meat to handle massive overbores. Enthusiasts often knocked out the thin cylinder sleeves, nicknamed tin cans, and dropped in .08 3-inch oversized pistons without breaking a sweat. But that was only the start. Many blocks from 1939 to 1953, especially the 3 and 3/16 inch versions, could safely go 125 inch over, and some even took a daring 187.5 inch overbore. That's a crazy amount of extra displacement squeezed out of a factory engine designed for everyday cars. It was weird, bold, and pure flathead spirit, turning a humble V8 into something ready for racing. The engine's odd flexibility and bore size became a calling card for hot rodders chasing cheap horsepower. 8. Quirky crank offset. Let's talk about our next flathead fact that feels almost wrong. The crankshaft wasn't actually centered in the block. Instead, it was offset by about 0.265 inches, a design Ford engineers used intentionally. This setup, called D-sax, shifted the piston center line away from the crank to change the way the engine handled its strokes. By doing this, the flathead gained better leverage during the power stroke, while easing the load and friction during compression and exhaust. On paper, it sounds like mechanical trickery, but in practice, it gave Ford's humble V8 a little boost in smoothness and efficiency. Most engines of the era kept their cranks perfectly centered, so this quirky offset made the flathead stand out even more. Weird? Definitely effective? Surprisingly so, it's proof that even budget-minded engines can hide clever, unconventional engineering choices. 9. Cracks by design. One of the strangest and most frustrating quirks of the Ford Flathead V8 was its tendency to crack right in the block. Overheating was often the trigger, thanks to the unusual way exhaust ports ran directly through the water jackets. This design dumped extra heat into the coolant, and when things got too hot, cracks followed. Seasoned builders know the drill. Cracks from head studs to the nearest water holes were practically expected. Some engines kept running with the damage hidden by a head gasket, but serious failures called for heavy repairs. Machine shops often had to stitch the block or press in dry sleeves to save them, which wasn't cheap or easy. Love the Flathead's power and history all you want, but its habit of splitting open made owning one both exciting and nerve-wracking. 10. Tiny V8s in the UK. Not every Flathead was a big American powerhouse. In Britain, Ford rolled out a scaled-down version known as the V860, displacing just 2.2 liters. It was designed to fit smaller European cars like the Ford 22 horsepower, but here's the weird part. The earliest versions had 2 exhaust ports per cylinder. That unusual layout created serious heat issues, and the little engines quickly gained a reputation for cracked blocks and cooling troubles. By 1936, Ford UK had to redesign the casting with a more normal 3-port exhaust system, and even retrofitted many of the older engines to keep them alive. Though it struggled in practice, the V860 proves how versatile the flathead design really was. From American hot rods to pint-sized British sedans, the flathead showed it could be adapted, even if it sometimes cracked under pressure. 11. A distributor that's also an ignition coil. One of the strangest features ever bolted to the Ford Flathead V8 was its all-in-one distributor and coil unit. Instead of a separate ignition coil mounted on the firewall, Ford engineer Emil Zorlein designed a compact housing where the coil was built directly into the distributor. At first glance, it looked efficient: fewer parts, cleaner packaging, and cheaper production. But in reality, this oddball setup turned into a reliability nightmare. The coil's position meant it overheated easily, leading to weak sparks, hard starts, and plenty of headaches for mechanics. By the late 1930s, Ford was already rethinking the idea, but thousands of cars went out the door with this quirky distributor design. It's a perfect example of how the Flathead's bold experiments sometimes backfired, leaving owners with equal parts innovation and aggravation under the hood. 12. Weird firing order. Let's talk about a quirky twist that set the Ford Flathead apart from nearly every other V8. Normally, cylinder number 1 sits on the left bank, right at the front. Not on the Flathead. Ford broke convention by putting cylinder number 1 on the right-hand bank, a move that confused plenty of mechanics who were used to industry standards. The reasoning wasn't random. Ford wanted uniformity across its engine lineup. So every Ford V8, regardless of size, started with the right bank as number 1. Strange as it was, this decision helped give the Flathead its distinctive firing order and a unique exhaust rhythm that hot rodders still recognize today. That odd, offbeat rumble became part of the Flathead's character, proof that Ford wasn't afraid to bend rules, even with something as basic as which cylinder fired first. 13. Mini compression. When the Ford Flathead V8 first hit the streets in 1932, it wasn't exactly squeezing air and fuel with much muscle. Its compression ratio sat at a shockingly low 5.0 to 1, paired with a modest 221 cubic inches that produced 65 horsepower. By modern standards, that's barely a whisper, but it made sense back then. Fuel quality in the early 1930s was poor, and Ford had to design an engine that wouldn't knock itself to pieces on low-octane gas. Even when the Flathead evolved through the decade, compression stayed tame, only climbing into the 6.3 to 1 range and topping out around 95 horsepower. Ford wasn't chasing maximum performance. They were chasing durability and affordability. The result was a weirdly soft-squeezing V8 that still powered millions of cars, proving that low compression didn't mean low impact. 14. Too cool to idle. Time for the 14th weird Flathead fact that still sparks debate: whether the engine actually runs better without thermostats. On most cars, thermostats are essential for keeping the temperature steady, but many old-school Flathead owners claim pulling them out helps fight overheating. The logic makes sense. Without thermostats, coolant flows more freely, easing the heat buildup caused by the Flathead's odd exhaust ports running directly through the water jackets. Some swear the engine idles smoothly and runs cooler this way, but not everyone agrees. Other builders argue that running 160 to 180 degrees Fahrenheit thermostats actually improves performance, especially in cold weather, by bringing the engine up to temperature faster and preventing sludgy oil buildup. So, which is it? The Flathead might be the only V8 where both answers are right, depending on where and how you drive it. Quirky, stubborn, and very Ford. 15. Slippery when pumping. The Flathead V8 had an oiling system with a built-in quirk that baffled plenty of owners. Its oil pump came with a bypass valve that sent excess pressure straight back into the pump inlet instead of feeding it into the bearings. In other words, higher pressure didn't always mean more oil reaching the engine. Things got even weirder when hot rodders bolted in high-volume aftermarket pumps. Instead of improving lubrication, the bypass just opened wider, creating foaming, heating, and cavitation that could actually starve bearings of oil. It was one of those cases where more was definitely not better. The Flathead's lubrication system needed balance, not brute force. Smart builders learned quickly that a properly matched pump or increased bearing clearances for racing was the real fix. Otherwise, the Flathead's own oil pump could turn against it. 16. Half-moon bell housing. One of the strangest quirks of the early Ford Flathead V8 was hiding right at the back of the block. From 1932 to 1947, the 59A Flathead didn't use a fully enclosed bell housing. Instead, Ford cast only a half-ring bell housing, which left the bottom of the flywheel exposed for anyone crawling under the car to see. It wasn't sloppy design. It was actually meant to make life easier for mechanics, giving quicker access to the clutch, flywheel, and rear crank seal without tearing everything apart. By 1948, Ford changed course with the newer 8BA and RT blocks, adding full coverage, stamped steel bell housings for cars and cast versions for trucks. It looked cleaner, worked better, and protected the flywheel. But that earlier peekaboo flywheel setup remains one of the Flathead's weirdest visual quirks. 17. Painted like a chameleon. The Ford Flathead V-8 didn't just change mechanically over the years, it even changed colors like a chameleon. From 1932 through 1940, most blocks rolled out in a deep dark green, a shade shared by both Ford and Mercury models until the early 40s. After World War II, starting in 1946, Ford gave the Flathead a dark blue coat, which stuck around until 1948. Things got bolder after that. Late 1949 through 1951 engines appeared in bronze, and by 1952 to 1953, Ford dressed Flatheads in eye-catching tangerine red or green, depending on the model. Trucks weren't left out either. They wore red until 1951, then switched to green for the final years. These paint shifts weren't random. They marked updates in models and years, giving the Flathead one of the most colorful visual histories of any V8. 18. Road draft tube. One of the Flathead's strangest features was the road draft tube, a metal pipe jutting down from the intake manifold. It wasn't decoration. This thing acted like a chimney for crankcase fumes. As the car moved, airflow under the vehicle created suction, pulling vapors right out of the engine. The system was surprisingly simple. Clean air entered through the oil cap, which had a mesh filter, circulated through the crankcase, and then exited through the tube. That steady airflow helped keep blow-by gases, sludge, and moisture from building up inside. Some modern owners swapped the tube for a PCV valve, but not everyone agrees it's an upgrade. Without the draft effect, crankcase pressure can rise, leading to leaks or oil burning. Primitive by today's standards, but undeniably clever, the Flathead found a low-tech way to breathe. 19. Peculiar lubrication path. The Flathead's oiling system was anything but straightforward. Instead of delivering oil directly to every bearing, Ford designed a circuitous lubrication path that started with the main bearings. Once they were fed, excess oil spilt over to the connecting rod bearings, supplying them indirectly. It worked, but it meant the entire bottom end lived or died on steady pressure. If your gauge showed a sudden drop, chances were good that trouble was brewing deep in the crank before a rod ever let go. Oddly enough, this strange setup gave mechanics and hot rodders a built-in warning system. By carefully watching oil pressure, they could predict bearing wear without tearing the engine apart. Weird but practical, the Flathead turned what looked like a flaw into a diagnostic tool, showing again how unconventional design sometimes paid off. 20. Surprising longevity abroad. The Flathead's American story ended in 1953, but the engine's life was far from over. Overseas, this side valve V8 kept right on working. In Europe and South America, production continued into the late 1950s, long after Ford US had moved on to overhead valve designs. The most surprising chapter came in France, where the Flathead powered military trucks and vehicles well into the 1990s. Think about that. An engine born in the early 1930s still serving in uniform 60 years later. Its simple design, rugged build, and easy-to-fix layout made it perfect for rough conditions where durability mattered more than cutting-edge efficiency. While hot rodders in the States were swapping in bigger, overhead valve motors, the Flathead kept proving its worth abroad. Weird but true, this humble V8 refused to quit, outlasting expectations by decades. So there you have it, 20 strange but true facts about the Ford Flathead V8. From its funky firing order to its decades-long life in French military trucks, this engine proved it wasn't just innovative, it was unforgettable. Sure, it had flaws, but those flaws gave it character. And that character made the Flathead a cornerstone of hot rodding, racing, and automotive history. Few engines have inspired as much loyalty, creativity, and respect as this one. Which Flathead fact surprised you the most? And do you think Ford should have kept refining it instead of moving on? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more deep dives into automotive icons.